Hello, hello. We are here to start chapter 6. The title is Hinds' Feet on High Places. This is the last chapter. When we left Much Afraid at the end of chapter 5, remember she had placed her whole self on the altar in the Canyon of Surrender. And the last sentence that we read was, a beautiful sense of peace filled her and she fell asleep. So now it's time for Much Afraid to wake up. Chapter 6. When Much Afraid woke from a deep and peaceful sleep, there was no sign of sorrow and suffering. Neither was there any sign of her enemies. They didn't want to come anywhere near the Canyon of Full Surrender. High above her was a cloudless sky and the peaks of the high places which shone dazzling white. She went to explore the canyon and found it to be warm and quiet. The ground was a soft carpet of green grass and sweet-smelling flowers. There was a great waterfall tumbling down into a river that was as clear as crystal. She went and dipped her fingers into the water. Then she stepped into one of the rocky pools. It felt so good. It was as if she was in a stream of bubbling life. When she finally stepped out of the water and stood on the mossy bank, she happened to look down at her feet. They were beautiful. The crooked, ugly feet were gone. Look at that. She has real normal feet. Then she remembered how the shepherd had spoken of the healing streams in the high places. Quickly, she stepped back into the pool and put her head under the clear water and splashed them all over her face. Then she found another little pool among the rocks, still and clear as a mirror. Kneeling down, she peered into the water. Her twisted mouth had disappeared. The face that looked back at her was as perfect and beautiful as that of a little child. For 3 days, Much Afraid felt as though she were wrapped in peace and happiness. She wandered around the little canyon, eating the delicious berries, bathing in the river, and resting on the mossy banks. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke suddenly from her sleep with a shock of joy tingling through her. Someone had called her name. She had not heard a voice, but she knew she had been called. She stood up and waited, but the only sound was the rushing waterfall. Then it came again, tingling through her, a call ringing down from some high place above. She looked around excitedly. She felt like running up the mountains, but where was the way out of the canyon? The rocky walls were steep and straight. Then she saw 2 deer like the one she had seen that day at the foot of Mount Injury. The hart was springing up the wall of the canyon, followed closely by the hind. Much Afraid did not wait another minute. With a flying jump, she reached the edge of the wall. Then, using the same footholds as the hart and hind, she went leaping up the cliff. Very quickly, she reached the top of the canyon, and she went on higher still toward the place that the call had come from. She leaped excitedly from rock to the top of the mountain. There was the shepherd, standing on the peak just as she knew he would be. But he wasn't dressed like a shepherd now. He was wearing a crown and royal robes, and his face shone with joy. See, he doesn't look like the shepherd anymore, huh? He is a king. He held out both hands and called to her with a great laugh. You with the hind's feet, jump over here. She gave one last flying spring and landed beside him on the top of the mountain. At last, he said, as she knelt at his feet, at last you are here. Your night of sorrow and weeping is over, and joy comes to you in the morning. The flower of love is blooming in your heart. It is time for you to receive your new name, as I promised. From now on, you are grace and glory. Isn't that a beautiful change from much afraid to grace and glory? She couldn't speak, but was silent with joy and thanksgiving and with awe and wonder. Gently, the shepherd king helped her to her feet. Now, grace and glory, give me the bag of stones that you collected on your journey. It's a good thing she didn't throw them all away, like in the last chapter she thought about, huh? She took the bag and passed it to him. He asked her to hold out her hands, and he emptied what was inside. She gasped with delight. Instead of plain little stones that she had put in the bag, out fell a heap of sparkling jewels. The king took each of the precious gems and set them on a fine circlet of gold. Do you know what that is? A circlet of gold. It's a circle, and he put all the gems in, and he placed it on her head. What's it going to be? A crown. As she watched, Grace and Glory remembered how she had almost thrown the stones away. She thought of how she had almost stopped trusting his promises. She was very happy she hadn't done either. He placed the crown upon her head. Now you are daughter of the king, Grace and Glory, he said. Now you are to live with me here on the high places. You will go where I go and share my work in the valley below. I have 2 helpers for you. When Grace and Glory heard those words, her eyes almost filled with tears. She remembered sorrow and suffering, the faithful friends he had given her before. It was through their help and gentle patience that she had been able to reach the high places. They had gone through the same hard journey, and now she was here, and they were not. She turned to the king to beg him to let her have them again for her helpers instead of someone new. But before she could speak, he smiled and said, "Here are the handmaidens I have chosen to be with you forever." 2 shining figures stepped forward. There we go. They look a little different than the ones who were wearing the veils, huh? They wore white gowns that sparkled in the morning light. They were tall and strong and very beautiful. They came toward her with love shining from their eyes. "Who are you?" Grace and Glory asked softly. "Will you tell me your names?" Instead of answering, they looked at each other and smiled. Then they held out their hands as if to take hers. Grace and Glory cried out in joy, "Why, you are sorrow and suffering. I was longing to find you again." They shook their heads. "Oh no," they laughed. "We are no more sorrow and suffering than you are much afraid. Don't you know that everything that comes to the high places is changed? Since you brought us here, we have become joy and peace." "Brought you here?" she asked. "Why, it was you 2 who dragged me here." Again, they shook their heads and smiled. "No, we could never have come here alone. Sorrow and suffering cannot enter the kingdom of love, but each time you accepted us and took our hands, we began to change. Now we are to be your friends and helpers forever." They put their arms around her and hugged her tightly. So with a new name and a glittering crown on her head, Grace and Glory came to the high places and entered the kingdom of love with joy and peace as her friends forever. So that's how different they look. And that's how different the shepherd looks. And this is how different Much Afraid looks. Because she's not much afraid anymore. She is Grace and Glory. What did you think about that? So this is the end of the first part of chapter 6, and we're going to get together tomorrow to finish the book. So I want you to think about the difference between what being afraid of everything means and what grace and glory means, and the difference between her friends, sorrow and suffering, who turned into joy and peace. And I will see you tomorrow.